Well, you know about what I'm proposing in Evolution Diverted, but let's start with a nutshell version. Our immediate predecessor species, the one we call Homo erectus, would have evolved into a creature somewhat resembling us 1 million or 1.5 million years from now. Except that around 450,000 years ago, colonists arrived, and from an advanced humanoid race living on a planet that moves at long intervals through the known solar system, spending most of its time in deep space beyond Pluto. They came and set up a base in southern Iraq. And after a long period of time, their gold miners working in the harsh conditions of African mines mutinied, creating a crisis for the home world because the mineral was essential for life there. The solution was to alter Homo erectus genetically in a laboratory, using their own DNA to craft a slave race, the first Homo sapiens. And the conditions of life of our kind under these extraterrestrial lords in Mesopotamia and in other centers that they set up, such as Egypt and India, for tens of thousands of years, became the source of all the ills of civilization. That's the nutshell. Now, if civilization's dire state, and we may well be pre-terminal, is actually connected with what I propose as humanity's origin in earliest times, then what I'm offering is one of the most important visions ever presented. If it's true, it can lead to an awakening for humankind and the beginning of a great healing. But the question is it true? That question is between all the lines of the book. Is this really what happened? Now, unfortunately, it's going to be a long time before it can be firmly substantiated or legitimately disproven. That's different than being attacked, which is inevitable. It's going to take the work of scientists and scholars in many disciplines over an extended period. So what do we do in the absence of confirmation for something that's potentially so vital? Well, I can offer evidence that bolsters the plausibility of the hypothesis that the tales from Mesopotamia about the gods are essentially historical. And I pile on that evidence, excuse me, in Evolution Diverted. And also I can demonstrate how useful the hypothesis is to resolve mysteries that are otherwise inexplicable, and how much understanding they provide for aspects of the human existence which are not so well understood. Those portions of the book can be thought of as a thought experiment. Hold on. A thought experiment. And that kind of utility for an idea is a soft measure of its validity. And I can do one more thing. I can try to support the hypothesis by letting you assess my reliability and authenticity, by revealing the intellectual, professional, and spiritual path leading to this outrageous vision of mine, a focused autobiography. So let's begin with my birth. I was a breech baby. So I began my journey down the birth canal backwards. Now, about a dozen years ago, I was doing a series of workshops that were designed to deal with the experiences before, during, and after birth. I was seeking healing from my birth trauma because the breech position was not the only complication. And Ray, that's the man who had devised this method, had learned that breech babies grow into adults with a strong tendency to do things their own way. Well, that seems to characterize my recent work. I later learned that the physical circumstances of my birth merely underscored a core trait that I was destined by the circumstances of the time and place of my birth. This came in the first reading in a recently revealed system of divination that has aspects of astrology in it, called human design. And Beverly, who's done many readings for me, explained that I was destined to be a one-of-a-kind sort of person, someone following inner guidance, unconcerned with convention, unmoved by judgment of society in general. This was hugely confirming for me because it meant that I had not been wandering randomly in my serial professions and divergent interests, but I'd been following a light. There's a corollary for that trait, and that it makes one a role model for others for being yourself. And of course, that was a good part of my message as a therapist. You know, be yourself. I just hadn't been aware that I'd been, in addition to proposing it, I'd been modeling it. Now, while talking about what this system of information about the self, human design, revealed, I'll talk about a few other core traits that are pointing me towards where I've arrived. First, I crave adventure for doing things. And that's because I only learn by experience. That's the only way I ever take things in. Like with the book, I just jumped in. I had no idea what writing was involved, writing a book like that involved. The ideas developed, in the process. They got clarified while it was working. There were no years of research and, thousands of 3x5 cards waiting to be organized. I just began writing. Another trait is that when committed to something, I persist no matter what. That no obstacle, no disappointment stops me. To me, that's unremarkable. Other people have, thought that was something a bit beyond the ordinary. Said, Mike, you got knocked down, you get up. You get knocked down, you get up. And to me, it's unremarkable. It's just the way it is. Another thing that the system revealed is that I have very effective means of expression. In other words, my voice will be heard. And that's something I had no idea about. It was also helped along the way to where I am now. And lastly, I've got abilities, which I kind of knew about, but they've never been articulated, for immediately knowing what's what. The ancient Greeks called it gnosis, knowing through immediate conviction, a knowing in the soul. which they distinguish from episteme, knowing through evidence and logic and knowing in the mind. And of course, it was a clinical gift. From time to time, a patient would stop me and said, "How could you possibly know that, about me?" And I have to say, "I don't know how I know. I just know." And it plays a role now in this work that I'm bringing forth, but it has the risk of making me seem irrational or arrogant or maybe possessed. But it's just because there's some things I just know. Okay, back to birth. Back to the timeline. Family lore is that it was a near-death experience for both mother and child. And then I had intense pain and screaming because I had a fracture of the clavicle that was not diagnosed. Mother had a postpartum depression, and it was 1942. Everything was shadowed by the war. My father was overseas with all the anxiety that involved. Right after the war, both my grandfathers died. And we moved, my nuclear family moved far from everything and everyone that had been familiar. Mother fell into psychiatric illness, and that claimed her twice a year for a few months at a time, all the rest of my life. The neighborhood was shattered a bit by having a lot of European refugees in it at the time. Matter of fact, Fred, my best friend in elementary school, had spent the first 3 years of his life in the attic in Amsterdam. And we were living in the shadow of nuclear devastation in the Cold War. As a matter of fact, whenever we had one of those horrible air raid drills at school, Fred would disappear for a few days. So I'm mentioning these aspects of early life because besides sowing the seeds for depression in myself, they prepared me for dealing with the dark side of human experience, which I took up in psychiatry, and have continued with my work resulting in the book, Evolution Diverted. Now, it presents a great hope, but getting there only through engaging with the darkness of human origins. I've got a strangely prominent memory for a minor event in a class play in the 5th grade. I'm a biblical character. And I remember this like it was yesterday. I had this line that I was to deliver with great formality. It is good to be known by all. Like, why would I remember that the way I do? Is it going to come to pass after I'm gone? It gives me the chills. Around the same time, about 11, maybe 12, having endured Hebrew school 3 times a week and the Saturday morning children's services, I had a sudden knowing, gnosis, that the God of the Israelites, all-powerful, all-seeing, judging, demanding, punishing, and rewarding, does not exist. Clear as day. So that was my first leap of faith into my knowing what's what. If I recall, I was a bit scared. So I realized that if I was wrong, I was doomed. But I was willing to take the chance. So secretly, I became an atheist. Now, I was way too young to take up the question that logically follows, which I'm dealing with and is central in Evolution Diverted, which is, how could a belief like that ever take hold? How could that happen? How could that be the nature of the creator of all? Okay. Jumping ahead a few years, high school was heavy in the sciences. And I left aiming for a career in applied physics. In college, I had the first experiences of my life of non-academic successes that gave me a confidence that's coming in very handy now, specifically in athletics and in business and in this. A man named Gino, an artist, a professor of painting, took me under his wing. And I think he was the first ever to see me as a whole being, not just a moody brainiac. And I was in near disbelief that this could happen. I hadn't sought it. I wouldn't have dared. But he drew out the visual artist in me that had been submerged, along with the musician, 6 years before, when I'd entered the Bronx High School of Science. A little bit later, I found myself on a full scholarship in the architecture program, at the University of Pennsylvania, a mecca of architecture in the time, and eventually into the office of the architect's architect, Louis Kahn. Builder, visionary, philosopher, teacher. For me, that was another transformative passage. For one thing, I came face to face with the type of person I'd only read about. Someone who was totally living his passion. His life was inseparable from his calling. That seems to be what's happening for me. Now, after 10 years in architecture, I decided to apply to medical school. And I figured having a letter of recommendation from a world famous figure couldn't hurt. So I went and went down to the office. I'd been away from there for a while, and presented my request. And Lou was silent. Everybody who'd ever worked for the man had the privilege of calling him Lou. And he was silent. I thought he was angry. I was jumping ship, abandoning the faith, you know. But he knew me well. And largely because of the way I'd embraced architecture, which to him was the core of all endeavors of civilization, much like Frank Lloyd Wright had called it the mother of all arts. He said that I could become anything. And it played out. Physician, fringe psychiatrist, now author, producer, more about that later, as if it was predicted in that office that day. More chills. Now, why was I leaving architecture, besides the fact that it wasn't a good enough fit for me? I'd encountered the work of another visionary, Wilhelm Reich, renegade scientist, working in the Western vitalist tradition that went back to the Greek philosophers with pneuma, the vital wind, the vital breath of life, animal magnetism of Anton Mesmer, the vital spirit of Henri Bergson, and others. Reich worked with electrical and optical instruments to explore what he called the life energy. And he concluded that there was a primordial energetic field that carries information that includes templates for life forms. Others have called it the morphogenetic field. In today's terms, that would translate into an informed energy that can organize molecules to create DNA. To Reich, this was the physical reality behind the mystical concept of God. So I was emerging from atheism. I was thrilled a few years later when George Lucas, gave us The Force. Now, with what he called biogenesis experiments, Reich observed organic matter of various kinds, highly sterilized, and working in parallel with very strictly controlled lab conditions. This material would break down and slowly reorganize in a sequence of steps into living amoeba. Heresy. Impossible. His experimental work has disappeared because it could not possibly be valid. When I was able to repeat some of this work in a lab course, it was absolutely breathtaking. To see these vesicles organize out of a blade of grass and start to pulsate and come together. This is over a course of several days, and then there'd be a free living organism. Spontaneous generation. Earl, some years later, a rabbi friend, asked me over lunch, Mike, how come you have so much more faith than I do? And I said, because I've seen God at work with my microscope. Now, he probably thought I was just referring to the wonder of nature, something abstract like that. But to me, I was really talking about the field, the source of all that exists, operating visibly. And I thought that a career in medicine would be the best way for me to explore this line of discoveries, however that might happen. So I jumped in medical school at the age of 30. It also led me to develop a bit of a library of other outsider scientists and scholars whose work was dismissed because it violated orthodoxy. In my first couple of years in medical school, I took a chance and organized a lecture series on alternative approaches to healing, bringing in speakers from acupuncture to voodoo. I think that was a first in a medical school. Eventually, I came upon the work of Zecharia Sitchin, the first scholar to propose that the tales of the gods of Mesopotamia were history, not fantasy. And that's when my ideas took off. In time, I encountered someone, we'll give her a pseudonym of Madeline, someone whose extreme childhood traumatization, as is often the case, had cracked open mundane reality for her and opened up the world of spirit, the many manifestations of the primordial field of the universe. And through her, I started to wake up to aspects of the field that Reich had not been interested in at all, including angelic beings, the discrete entities within the totality of the field, homeopathy, flower essences, the pendulum, numerology, and most important, astrology. I should mention that engagement became traumatizing for me too, and could easily have destroyed my life. No details right now, but I just have to remember that my destiny was to only learn through experience. I learned. Now, I had many readings in astrology over the years, like I had in human design. The first one by Mary just blew me away. First, I learned that my elementary energy was water. I was very, very strongly dominant in my makeup. I was an emotional being. Total surprise. I'd always thought I was an intellectual being. Big reorientation. I also learned that the chart said that the last phase of my life would be glorious. That was really helpful because at the time it appeared like I was circling the drain. It actually does feel that way now. And it has for a while. And her meditation on the chart was that I would discover the system of systems. I didn't know what that meant. But now I seem to have found an overarching idea which appears to have the potential to reorganize many disciplines. Coming true. Now, in this talk, I'm aiming to, help you evaluate my reliability, yet by giving credence to astrology and human design, I might be undercutting your confidence that I'm a rational being. So I'm going to diverge a bit and sketch a possible connection between the motions of the planets and the courses of our lives. Because if there is one, it's not supernatural, it has to be natural. Even if it's beyond the limits of our present understanding of nature. So, bear with me. Fact. Most of our DNA, the vast majority of the DNA, is not genetic. The functioning chromosomes are a small part of the mass of DNA in our nucleus. The function's not known. But could they just be there, be junk? Fact. Through the solar system, there's a stream of particles that run through the galaxy without charge and nearly without mass. Very hard to study, the neutrinos. A constant stream. Idea, some consider it fact, but I'll call it right now idea, that everything, whoops, I just hung up my knee here, sorry. Everything has consciousness. Worm, tree, boulder, everything has consciousness. And the planets, they are immense bodies of consciousness with discrete personalities. In shifting relationship with each other, joining, aligning, opposing, in a manner much like the shifting dynamics of a family. That's one of the bases of astrology. So, in the revelation of the human design system came this idea. Makes sense to me. It's plausible, I'll put it that way. That the neutrinos record the ever-shifting relationship between the planetary personalities. And they transmit the relationship at the time that they're passing through onto the non-genetic DNA, leaving an imprint at the time of birth and also in utero, giving frequent updates through the course of life. In my understanding, that means that the non-genetic DNA affects the bioenergetic field, and the field in turn does a lot to shape the course of the life. One reason why I took as I did to the system of human design was that as I learned it, I realized it incorporates a fundamental fact that had hit me, gnosis once again, seemingly out of the blue, that each human life is the intersection of two streams of inheritance. The ancestral genetic line crossing the line of the soul's interactions. The soul's incarnations over time. That intersection is the unique life. And in human design, those lines define what the soul knows already coming in and what it is here to learn. Now, I said a little while ago that my life had been upended by a relationship that turned disastrous, and I was in real danger, legally, financially. It was a dark time. And one of the things that led me to was journaling in a consistent way. In nighttime, dealing with portents of doom, I get up and start writing spontaneously, going deeper and deeper into the anguish, making it more and more articulated, with a leap of faith each time that the field would not inflict this kind of suffering except for the benefit that would result. So I plunged in without restraint every time, expecting some important revelation to come my way. Yet knowing, like I did at the age of 11, that, that the consequences of being wrong here would be terrible. What would, if nothing light got me out of the dark, where would I wind up that day? But every time, 100% of the time, that faith was justified. Light came out of the dark. The other thing that time of trouble led me to was my gratitude practice. And there I took another kind of leap of faith and regularly out in the field gave thanks for what I desperately needed and wanted, though was absent in the present. I just gave thanks. The principles involved in that kind of practice were, one, that time is an illusion, necessitated by material existence. And the mere fact that I didn't have what I needed was irrelevant. And second principle was that the field is beneficent and loving. A similar risk, crushed if proven wrong, and again, 100% of the time, I actually received what I've been thankful for in advance, seemingly in advance. Now, my devotions, my regular devotions outdoors, include gratitude for the spirit intending that through my voice, the collective will hear what spirits wants the collective to learn. I just give thanks for that, even if it hasn't happened. In Evolution Diverted, I distinguish us, civilized humanity, from the indigenous peoples of the earth, seeing them as potential resource for the world's healing through what they've preserved, because I propose that they are the descendants from the humans who slipped away from the domains ruled by the extraterrestrials and embraced the terrestrial parent species that all humans carry within. Now, what would a Jewish intellectual guy from Brooklyn know about the native life? Well, first there's my reading and study, of their traditions and crafts, which gave me a roadmap, but mostly was the experiences I had with men and women in our dominant culture who had embraced indigenous principles and practices in their personal and professional lives. They partially gone native. Turns out it's quite a range of experience now that I think about it. There was one-to-one shamanic healing, some of it with a guy named Ed, and out of that came the realization that the physician role was giving me a false persona. It was interfering with the expression of my true self. And that was the start of my exit from the profession of medicine. You know, in our culture, there's a very poor overlap between doctor and healer. Sweat lodges did many of those. Ceremonial cleansing of the soul via the cleansing of the body with intense heat. The shamanic precursor of saunas and steam baths. Soul retrieval ceremonies with someone named Diana. Several of those. The principle there was that in traumatization, a fragment of your soul splits off in order to preserve itself undamaged by what's happening in reality. And in soul retrieval, the fragments are asked, if they're ready, to come back in. Come back in. Animal spirits, at the same time, are invited to bring their strengths into your existence. At some point, I realized that I'd been spending way too much time indoors and that I was no longer at all at home in nature. So one of the solutions for that was to take an indigenous wilderness skills class, organized by a guy named Tom, who in his teens had been trained by an Apache scout elder. And what I learned, making fire and bringing down small game and little traps and how to get water from dew collected overnight, tracking animals, building shelters out of nothing. I learned that if I put the time into it, I could acquire enough skills to survive in nature. And that meant that I'd be comfortable enough in the wilderness in order to undergo a vision quest, which is something I've been wanting to do. So I did those modeled after native rites of passage, led by a guy who named himself Sparrow. That involves a 4-day solo fasting with rituals, seeking knowledge needed for oneself and one's community. I did a number of workshops in what was called shaking medicine, a westernized, somewhat westernized version of the communal dance practice of the people of the Kalahari Desert, the Bushmen. And I did quite a number of family constellation workshops, the work of, what's his name? I hate when this happens. It'll come to me. Anyway, it looks like Western psychotherapy, but it's really a shamanic practice, heavily influenced by the Zulus. Ancestor spirits are invited into the circle to reveal the source of somebody's problem in the present. His family constellation is invoked. And the problem that was dwelling in the family field and manifesting in one person was revealed and treated. The core indigenous tenet in this practice is that person, family, and community are one, absolutely inseparable. So my present practices linked to the native worlds are recognizing the Trinity. And again, this is outdoors, not every morning, but often. The Trinity of Mother Earth, Father Sky, and the Maker of all, around and within, the Great Spirit. Acknowledging the power of the medicine wheel, the four cardinal directions in the native understanding of life are aligned with the four seasons of life: East, birth and rebirth, springtime; South, childhood, innocence and joy, summertime; West, young adulthood, learning, introspection, autumn; North, maturity, wisdom, generosity, winter; and beyond the North, this is not traditional, but fits perfectly, beyond the North, beyond the seasons of life, death, the ancestors through the generations, and the love spirits of the loved ones for the incarnations of this soul. Also, to be thanked, recognize the animal spirits who had come in during my several soul retrievals, and of course the standing people, the trees, always watching over me. After Reich, the outsider that I got most into was Immanuel Velikovsky. Read all his books. His contributions were one, that behind ancient tales, many ancient tales, that were believed to be magical and mythical, there were actual extraordinary events. He was a psychoanalyst, and what sparked his research into the Egyptian and late Mesopotamian documents was that he sensed a conviction and a sense of awe in the written accounts. To him, that meant that something had happened, even if they weren't totally factually recorded. Two, he held that the planets and the moons, after they formed, did not constitute a stable solar system, but they were rearrangements, including in early historical human times. Heresy at the time, recognized now. And also that developments on Earth were not always smooth and continuous, but that the planet had gone through great cataclysms. In studying his work and him and his career, for me, one was that if one challenges the establishment, the knives come out fast and sharp. And if you're radical, it's too easy to be too sure of yourself and to engage in fights with convention. And then you're only mirroring the establishment without knowing you're doing it. The most recent outsider that I've gotten into was Zecharia Sitchin, I mentioned. And I built on his remarkable discoveries by, one, reorganizing his findings and making them much more easy to absorb. And I've used psychological and neuropsychological processes to connect the forgotten history of humankind that he first hypothesized with the plight of civilization. And have used that history to suggest how it can begin in the healing of ourselves and our planet. Now, the actual development of the work, now called Evolution Diverted. In the year after 9/11, I was training in the history of trauma. I was training in the treatment of trauma and the history of trauma. And I realized that civilized humanity, viewed as a single entity, acts and always has acted just like a person in trauma. For example, overreactive, but also numb, out of touch with the social and physical environment, self-destructive, challenged to learn from experience, and violent. Now, what could have caused the innate threat responses that have evolved in reptiles to protect life to become chronically overactive and the source of massive dysfunction? Somewhat later, I was training further in the system of affects, the biological core of all the emotions that evolved in mammals also to protect life. And had a similar realization that civilized humanity, viewed as a single entity, was acting and always had acted just like a person defending against emotions based in one of the affects, shame. For example, attacking others, denying truth, withdrawing from reality. Am I describing a person who's presently very prominent, who's evading shame? Now, what could have caused an affect which had evolved to protect life to become the source of so much suffering? Much earlier, I had another question. Why civilized humanity's thinking processes had gotten so stuck on the matter of identity and purpose? It seemed incomprehensible that we were such a misfit on this planet, but we couldn't figure out why. And then it hit me that Sitchin's radical history of the species could answer these three quandaries. Endless fighting in the wars of the extraterrestrial lords, who were constantly going after each other for power and glory and riches, produced combat trauma in the human soldiers, which spread by contagion to the entire population, resulting in the early traumatization of civilization, which was then transmitted through several channels of our functioning down through the centuries. 2, the conditions as de facto slaves to superior beings, totally dependent on them, formed an identity for early civilized humanity, being inadequate, inferior, dispensable, servile, leading to self-scripts that created a vulnerability, an unnatural vulnerability to the shame-based emotions. These also have been transmitted generation to generation. And third, coming into existence without a community of our own kind, without a niche in nature, the only species to ever have done that. Our first ancestors were in confusion. Who are we really? Where do we belong really? And until now, there's been no way to answer those questions. I was further amazed when I realized that each one of these three categories of dysfunction were controlled in one of the three divisions of the brain that had evolved in three stages of evolution. In each, there was a division. In each of these divisions, there was life protective circuits that got overloaded, leading to malfunction, much like an overloaded immune system results in an autoimmune disease. So I had all the pieces of a hugely complex puzzle in my hands, and I realized that I was in a unique position to put it together. Now, after about 10 years of telling myself, I've got to write this book, I've got to do this, what am I waiting for? Got to get it, has to be done. I began sharing life and house with someone I'll name, give a pseudonym, Elise. And suddenly I was writing. Beginning, as I said, with the barest outline. Now, I mentioned to someone I encountered, actually at one of the shaking medicine workshops, and I dared to mention, this was totally new for me, that I was beginning to write a book, my first book. And she said, is it fiction or nonfiction? And I surprised myself by saying, it's a work of anti-fiction. And what I meant was that if what I was proposing was true, much of accepted human story would be revealed to be not fact, but long believed fiction. Now, the witticism came easily because it was really what I'd been doing for years as a therapist, teasing out the fact of actual childhood, real experiences, from the fiction, the stories that children all create in order to soften and to comprehend events, experiences. Both of those, the facts and the fictions, become conflated in the adult memory and also interfere with perceptions in real time. So I imagined a vast anti-fiction campaign for humankind being sparked by the book that I was about to write. More chills. Now, the process was full of surprises. Essential books and articles started popping up like I was a magnet of some kind. And people also. My writer friend, Joe, hi Joe, taught me that the book, every section of the book, every chapter of the book needed the narrative arc. A beginning, climax, resolution, and transition to the next piece. I had no idea that was important. Complete reorganization of everything I've written so far. Richard, a teammate back in college days, now a renowned epidemiologist, after reading the first draft, a pre-publication draft, he wrote, Mike, this is not science, it's art. And at first I was taken aback, and then I was delighted. I was relieved and reoriented. In a workshop led by my friends Mary and Gary, involving applied epistemology. Remember episteme, gnosis? The question came up, what is your primary role in this lifetime? Whoa. And it just hit me. I'd never thought of this before. storyteller. Huh. Now, I reflected that in healing, that's very much what had been going on. It was as if I'd said, I mean, this was never articulated, but it was as if I'd said, well, we know your life story. Now, together, we're going to write another with more of your truth in it. And look, the information was changing me. I had this insight, again, gnosis, that our present consciousness includes three poorly integrated, archaic forms of consciousness, imprints in our field. The terrestrial parent species, the one who is totally at one with nature, and the ultimate source of our wishes to just be, to stop all this doing, and just be at one with nature. 2, the extraterrestrial parent species, here to exploit the planet, the ultimate source of all of our feelings of, I don't belong here. And 3, the consciousness of the first human children of these two species, confused beings, the ultimate source of all of our feelings of inferiority. Now, these function independently, sometimes in conflict with each other. And I thought they could be brought into alliance. And this had a profound solidifying and settling effect on me. It seemed like I was resolving a three-way split that I didn't know that I've been carrying. This was something to share. Many years before, in my doctor mode, one of my patients had asked, why are you hidden in the office here? Why aren't you out there teaching? But I had no interest in what I knew. I didn't know that I was waiting for my teaching assignment. And another guy who'd been talking with a friend who was also a patient of mine told me that they had decided that Mike could change the world. When I remember that, I get more chills. I get something else when I remember the nickname they gave me, Yoda. Now, in the course of time, I was sharing life with another. She's named on the acknowledgement page. Had a remarkable gift for editing, which she could do on the fly. As I read aloud, modifying the language in the book so it became more lucid, less academic. More important contribution, she helped me shift my stance away from tending to be combative, impatient, and intolerant. Me? And align better with my real intention, which involves manifesting compassion for the suffering of the world and acceptance of anyone who would stop to listen. Now, I conceived of the project as expanding my role in healing individuals to offering something that could be healing for the collective. And she made me aware that I had an opportunity to bring back the healing to individual people in a different way, the listeners. It was a matter of loving, not instructing. Now, in spite of all the things that had, built up confidence for me, ambivalence was persisting. I was very unsure about my role in this. I was concerned But I could be confident in the writing, but afraid that I'd make a mess of the presentation, and it would all wind up buried in ridicule. Inadequacy. I mean, after all, who was this insignificant first Homo sapien slave to take on the gods? My hesitancy was brought out starkly in a new warrior training workshop, heavily influenced by Native American ideas, by the way, an activity of a wonderful organization, the Mankind Project. Because at that point, I had not publicly spoken a word about my concepts, and I was dared to just do it. So unrehearsed, with 20 minutes at my disposal, I laid it out to a small group who was seated around me, and they were spellbound. And I got it, that they were getting it. And the man who was sitting next to me, because there was something had come over the whole group, and he said, "Mike, give us a prayer." And what came out of me was, "The way home is open." That influenced the first title that I gave the book. Now, how to disseminate vision, because the content is difficult, it's too radical, too complex. It needed to be made easier by some sort of carrier wave. Now, I'd already written the Mesopotamian tale within Evolution Diverted, of the long narrative of the gods, and that ran through the Mesopotamian artifacts, and I had made it more and more poetic, but something more was needed. The tale had to be presented dramatically, and something amazing happened. At a hallowed spot near my home, where members of the Religious Society of Friends had been meeting for over 370 years, the community had welcomed me and was open to listening. And Molly and Tim, hi Tim, musically gifted members of the community, joined me in creating a stage performance, a modest stage performance, that was recorded by Ira, my cinematographer brother. Even more amazing, that video helped to open the way to a performance staged in New York with a cast of 6. Music, dance, projected images in a renowned cutting-edge venue that had been developed within the small factory that had been built by my grandfather. And that's a story for another time. And that video, I'm imagining, is going to help open the way to the feature film that's growing out of Evolution Diverted. How that happens, that's a story yet to be told.